I'm Laurel Hightower, and I'm filled with existential dread. I am also a horror author, so that works very well. And I am going to be doing two short readings from a couple of books, Crossroads and Below, because I write very, very short chapters. So Crossroads deals with a woman named Chris, whose adult son has passed away a couple of years before. She ends up making kind of an accidental sacrifice, and he starts coming back to her, but it's kind of questionable what the motives are and what's going on there. So there's kind of your scene set up. Chris was nervous, checking the time every 30 seconds or so. She'd never done this before, and she didn't know how it might affect the visitation. She would have loved to have seen him up close before this, maybe even touch him. But it had seemed an unspoken rule of the game that she stayed inside and viewed him from above. Maybe he wouldn't come with her waiting here. Maybe he'd never come again, a spell broken by her lack of faith, and she'd be grieving her ineptitude the rest of her days. But inertia had never been Chris's besetting sin. She didn't hear Trey coming, he was just there. She blinked, because she hadn't even seen him appear, or materialize or anything. He was there and speaking in the same breath. "What are you doing down here, Mom?" he asked, looming over her, features pinched in a way that indicated pain or annoyance. Chris stopped, mouth open, looking up at him. She searched his face and was reassured. It was him. For Trey, it was only that, for a second there, it hadn't sounded like him. His brows descended further. "What's wrong? Don't you know your own son?" he asked, reading her mind. She shook it off, reached a hand out to touch his shoulder. He didn't stop her, and she gripped it, feeling the bone beneath. "Of course, I do. And what are you doing here?" "Waiting for you. Is it not okay? Am I not supposed to get this close?" He shrugged, and her hand slipped from his arm. "I don't know. I don't make the rules." She frowned. "Then who does?" He dug his hands in his pockets and looked up into the clear, dark sky. His breath made little clouds as he exhaled, same as hers. "I don't know," he said again. "Maybe no one does." He dropped his gaze and looked at her. "Why haven't you done it before?" She smoothed his hair out of his eyes, and again he let her, and his hair felt cold and sticky, stiffened with something dark and viscous. "Because I was afraid to disappoint." He nodded. "I was too. That's why I told you to stay up there. So why'd you come tonight?" She took a deep breath. "Because you're already disappearing, aren't you?" He didn't answer, not at first. And after a minute, he raised one shoulder and dropped his gaze. "I think so. That's what it feels like." He sounded so sad, so lost, and it broke her heart. She touched his hair again, ignoring the unpleasant texture. "Okay. What are we doing now?" He gave vent to a frustrated laugh. "I don't know, Mom. I just got done telling you I don't know how it works. I don't even know how I got here in the first place." His eyes met hers. "Do you know?" She considered not telling him. He'd always been so protective of her, and she worried that he'd tell her to stop if he knew what she was doing. She hedged. "I'm making a sacrifice, I guess you could say." His brows went up and he took a step away from her. "Like the animal?" "Jesus, Mom!" His eyes went white. Not Penny Lane." She laughed, that strange little doubt silenced by his use of the cat's name. "Of course not. No animals were harmed in the making of this visit." He grinned. "Okay, good. So then more like what? Personal sacrifice?" The nicks and cuts that patterned her skin put up a throb of protest. "Exactly." "So has anything been different about it? Anything changed?" She shook her head. She was never haphazard about the amount of blood she spilled. She'd worried that there was a precise measurement she had to meet, or she would miss seeing her son, her sacrifice, wasted. "Nothing's changed that I know of." He shrugged again. "Maybe it has to be more." She frowned. "More what? More quantity? Or more quality? Maybe the nature of it has to increase if you want to keep going." "Maybe," he said, leaning in close. "Whatever you're giving up has to be worth more to be effective." She watched him, feeling the blood drain from her face, glad it was so dark. "You think so?" He laughed. "Hell, I don't know, Mom. All I know," his voice trailed off and the smile dropped. "All I know is how I feel. I'm just tired and faded or something. It's getting worse." Chris could tell. She knew she hadn't been wrong in discerning there was something off with her son. She took a breath. "Okay, you could be right. I'll work on it. Make some tweaks. In the meantime," she stopped, afraid of rejection in a way she never had been with Trey. He seemed fragile, though, or maybe brittle was the word she was looking for. As moody and explosive as he'd ever been in the throes of adolescence. He blew his breath out. "In the meantime, what?" "In the meantime, do I take him aside? Get hard?" He shook his head. "I can't. I don't even know what one feels like anymore." She could tell he was getting ready to leave her again. She reached up to the full extent of her 5'2" frame and threw her arms around his neck, drawing him close. "It feels like this, Trey," she said into his ear when he leaned down and put his head on her shoulder. He sighed and it sounded like crying. She patted his back and kissed his cheek and didn't think about the way he smelled, like something past its expiration date, or the way her lips felt greasy after touching his skin. She just held him, and she would have stayed like that until she died if he wouldn't. But he pulled away far too soon, and she was left standing in the cold, her arms bereft, watching him go, wondering how to make it right, how to give more than she already was, wondering how much of her it would take. So that's the end of that chapter. Crossroads. And then I'm going to do a short one from below, which is my Mothman tale. So just for a short setup on this, we have Addie, who is making an ill-judged solo journey through the mountains of West Virginia to get to a horror convention. And she gets a little bit of help from a trucker named Mads, who offers to lead her out, and then things go to hell when he sails off of an overpass. So this is when she's deciding she's going to see what she can do. Addie managed 2 sliding sideways steps down the slope of the culvert before her shoes lost traction and she took a 20-foot slide on her left hip. "Fuck!" she screamed, her fingers scrabbling for purchase on the loose rock, her flesh on fire where it ground against the hillside. The bottom dropped out of her stomach, but she caught herself on the exposed root system before her mind had a chance to picture the worst-case scenario. There was plenty of time after, with her arm hooked around the sturdiest protrusion, staring straight down into the dark nothing where her right foot dangled. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to force the intrusive thoughts from her head, picturing her spine fracturing against the rock, her skull bursting like an overripe pumpkin, her lungs punctured and unable to draw breath. That last part felt all too real, her chest tightening, asthma squeezing her airways. She hadn't thought of that, her allergies under control in winter's frozen grip, and had left her rescue inhaler in her car. She hadn't had an anxiety-induced attack in years, but she remembered how to ground herself. "I feel rocks," she said in a shaky voice. "I smell dirt, I taste snow in the air, and I see..." She made the mistake of leaning another inch or 2 out, and dizziness overwhelmed her. "I see fuck all," she muttered. "And I hear..." It was on the tip of her tongue to say she heard nothing, for the hillside was strangely quiet, when a sound of rushing wind came from overhead. The stubborn tree whose roots she clung to creaked and shook with the weight of something big settling in its branches. Addie whimpered when dirt rained down from above, the tree's tenuous hold beginning to give way. She felt like the damn coyote, hanging almost comically into nothing while the roadrunner settled in overhead, sending her to her doom. She couldn't find it in her to laugh, wondering what impossibly heavy thing had landed in the branches above. No matter what she saw when she looked up, it was only going to make things worse. "Then don't look," came her ex-husband's voice in her head, reasonably, and Addie decided to take his advice for now. Hazy dread filled her at the idea, linked to something she couldn't quite remember. Whatever it was, to look upon it was to freeze in terror, and she couldn't afford that, so she stuffed the certainty away in a dark corner of her mind. Her hands sweating despite the cold, she managed to edge inch by inch back to, if not solid ground, then at least something more stable than the empty dark. With both feet planted and her arms still wrapped tight around her savior tree, she was able to make herself look down far enough below to see her next landing spot, no more than 8 feet down. But there were no holds, so she would have to let go and drop. She told herself the plateau beneath was wide enough to hold her, even with the inevitable slide and stumble, but she didn't believe it. She couldn't make herself pry loose of the tree, her arms frozen against her brain's commands, but she couldn't go back up, so the only way was down. A fact she was slow to come around to until a piercing whistle sounded from overhead, the branches trembling wildly as whatever perched above her shifted position. Dead, dry leaves, the last holdouts of summer, fluttered onto her face and down the front of her coat. The whistle jarred her enough to let go, but without planning the drop. She was in free fall, weightless, her stomach doing somersaults until she landed hard on her back, wheezing as she struck, the breath forced from her lungs. At first she couldn't move, locked into position with her wide gaze on the sky above. There were stars, but only at first. Another rush of air and the light in the valley was once more blotted out. The flashlight was in her coat pocket, and she'd fallen in just the right way to trap it beneath her lower back. Her eyes bulged in the dark, desperate for a sight of anything, but she existed in a state of lightless nothing. Had she gone blind from the impact, paralyzed herself? Would she die of exposure on this hillside while Mads bled to death in a dark tunnel? Her heart thudding, lungs aching, she tried to move, to shift off her side without rolling into nothing, but she sensed something just above her. She still saw nothing, not even glowing red eyes, though she had no idea where that thought came from. Her nerves screamed that something was just above her, coming ever closer, near enough to touch. She pictured herself pinned beneath a rock outcropping she couldn't see, unable to squeeze herself out, and claustrophobia took hold of her. She whimpered, closed her eyes, and wondered how long it would take to die. The radio crackled to life in her other pocket, unmuffled by the weight of her body. Low, wordless sobbing made her catch her breath. She pictured how much worse it was for Max, trapped far beneath and certainly gravely injured. It helped to calm her, slow her breathing, and ease back her panic. Ma'am? Addie? Shit. She needed to get to the radio, reassure Mads while he was conscious and lucid enough to understand her. Too afraid to roll in any direction, she was relieved to find she could move her left hand and reached up to see what was above her. Nothing seemed as her fingers encountered only cold, and the sense of a great looming something eased. She managed to push herself to a sitting position, her lower back screaming against the punishment it had taken, relief flooding her heart and moving the heart blood in her limbs. She nearly convinced herself she'd imagined the presence, the closest above, when her right hand brushed something leathery, soft, and warm before it receded into darkness. That chapter. Thank you.
My name's Jessica Leonard, and I am the author of Antioch, which is for sale downstairs, but I am not reading Antioch today. I'm going to be reading from a novel that is not published yet, so you can't buy it, but if you really like it, assume Antioch is just as good, and go buy that, and if you don't like it, assume that Antioch is very different, and go buy that. So I'm going to start with a opening couple paragraphs, and then we're going to do a little Zach Morris timeout. We're going to skip ahead a little bit, but don't worry, you're going to be able to keep up. It's going to be great. We're going to have a really good time. Okay. Oh, and it's called Conjuring the Witch. So, there are witches in the woods. The Reverend told them this every Sunday, and while some assumed he was being figurative, there were others among the congregation that weren't so sure. They cast long looks out to the thick green brush that surrounded the eastern and southern sides of the Lillian Assembly of our Lord, and wondered, are they out there? There was a great glowing cross on the outside of the church that faced into the forest. Its bright blue pale light illuminated the trees and created new and complex shadows where nature never intended them to be. This was their defense against the witches. And even the ones who didn't really believe there was anyone, let alone a witch out there, felt a sense of comfort knowing the gold LED force field protected them. Okay, time out. So Steve and Nicole Warby are new in town. They've been there about a year. Steve is a farmer, and he fits in, and he loves it, and life's good, and they go to church. But Nicole is not so sure. She doesn't really know what her purpose in this town is. But recently, Nicole went into those woods, and she saw some stuff, and so things have been a little bit different for her. So that's where we're at now. As Nicole cooked dinner, she listened intently for the new wind chimes in her yard. So many of them together made a light, dissonant symphony that soothed her. She wished she could explain to Steve why she needed them, but knew he would never understand. Things were different for her. Things were changing for her. They had already changed. She didn't feel like the same soft, directionless child who had moved to Lillian. It had started in the woods, when she'd seen those shoes she wasn't supposed to see. The same shoes that wouldn't be there if she went looking for them again, because they didn't belong there. Not in that place, not in that time. Those shoes were a whisper. She understood things about the woods now. Once she'd been afraid of them and thought they were evil, but woods are not good or evil. They simply are. They take in what they are given, and sometimes they absorb, and sometimes they reflect. Men create things, and they trust that that creation is always a gift, believing that all they conjure is good simply because it comes from them. But sometimes they create the monsters that they fear, and the woods are simply there to observe and keep and hold. Nicole was now a thing to be held by those woods, and it was better by far than being held by the men who met there. After dinner, Steve fell asleep on the couch and dreamed again, for the first time, about the chimes. The whole world was hollow tones, glittering in the sunshine, and something different in the moonlight. In the moonlight they slid. In the trees and through the air, they slipped into places they hadn't been before and built nests. When he awoke, it was past midnight. The air in the house felt stagnant, and he was sweating. A light was on in the kitchen, and as he went to turn it off, something out in the yard caught his eye. Nicole was in the tree. "What the fuck is going on?" he mumbled. His wife was hunched on one of the low, thick limbs of the gum tree just to the left of the patio. He was seeing her through the glass of the kitchen and the screens of the sun porch, but it was her, knees up around her ears, hands holding onto her ankles. He couldn't tell if she was wearing anything at all. Her edges bled together. She peered at him, and he thought she must be glowing, because just exactly how could he see her in the dark? The kitchen light illuminated some of the yard, but not into the trees. Even if the moon was completely full, and he didn't think it was, he shouldn't be able to see her so plainly. Fear, irrational and hard, gripped his heart. He had to go outside and get his wife out of the tree, but he didn't want to. As ashamed as he felt, he couldn't deny that what he really wanted to do was lock the door and turn out the lights. Let her stay out there and be weird all on her own. She could leave him out of whatever this was. "Penny for your thoughts?" Steve yelped and leapt back and away from the voice. "Wow, you're jumpy," Nicole said. She smiled at him and went to the refrigerator and retrieved a small bottle of cranberry juice. Steve didn't respond, just looked back out the window. He didn't see anything in the trees except for the wind chimes. Fear came back into his chest, but this time different. This time it was worse. It was the kind of fear that slips into your heart when you're confused and alone. The shortness of breath you feel when you don't know what to do and the situation is hopeless. "I gotta check the yard," he said. He didn't turn on any lights, deciding that his eyesight would be more reliable once it adjusted to the night. The tree was annoyingly average. Steve didn't know what he'd hoped to find, but it sure wasn't nothing. Nicole was outside next to him now. She was wearing solid white cotton pajamas that buttoned up the front. She was sipping her juice loudly, and Steve had to stop himself from telling her not to spill like he would a child. "What's out here?" she asked. "I don't guess I know. I sure thought I saw something, though. Sure did." His voice trailed away, and he looked instead up into the sky, hoping to see a bird or a dinosaur or anything at all to make things feel okay again. "Sometimes I think I see things, too," Nicole whispered. He looked back at her, and for a moment he thought there was juice all over her top, and in another moment it was blood, and in another moment it was clean as fresh snow. "I think I should get some sleep." "Why don't I make breakfast in the morning?" Nicole suggested. Her lips were a little too red, or at least Steve thought they were. "That'd be nice, but don't put yourself out. We can just see whoever gets up first. No pressure." He said all this as he walked back into the house, and it wasn't until he'd finished the last sentence that he realized his wife was not behind him listening. He turned around, and there she was, not in the tree now, but huddled under it, hugging herself in a tight ball. His first thought was how dirty her pajamas would get, and the absurdity made him laugh, and the laughter made him nervous. He was cracking up. "Nicole," he called to her. She raised one arm and waved at him, long and dramatic, like she was on a desert island and flagging down a rescue ship. "Penny for your thoughts?" he whispered. He closed the door and walked deeper into the house. The only things on the second floor were the master bed and bathrooms. He decided that it was time to go to bed. Nicole was standing on the staircase landing. She was pushed back into the corner, up on her tiptoes. The sound of her teeth chattering was like broken Morse code. The flash of her jaw as she chopped faster and faster was impossible. "You're going to hurt your feet doing that," he said. He meant to say teeth, but it was too late now. And from the kitchen, Nicole said, "Who needs feet anyway?" And in the bedroom, it looked like Nicole was under the blankets already. He could hear her soft, deep breathing, but the longer he listened, the more it sounded like growling. "Listen, I'll stay on my side and you stay on yours," he told the room. He slipped under the covers and closed his eyes tight. "You know, honey," Nicole whispered in his ear, "I don't think there are any witches in those woods, none at all."